while they're fixing the poems, I want to thank Riley and Marco and everyone else involved in organizing this truly neat conference, probably, in terms of importance, the most important bar none these days. And for generously inviting me. It's great to travel again, my second time this summer/fall. And to see an old friend and make new friends, and for giving me the opportunity to think through some of the issues I had been thinking about throughout the pandemic. So when I got this invitation, it was not something that came out of the blue in terms of my own thinking about these issues. And as you will certain topics will be repeated multiple times throughout the coming 2 days. And so if you hear things that Marco mentioned already and Riley mentioned in my own talk, it's simply because I think that's the nature of the game. We'll have these reference points of Agamben and Foucault that are obvious. But I think the permutations of how we deal with them will constitute some of the interesting foci that we'll have to deal with today and tomorrow. So without further ado, the title of my talk has not changed. Needful Facts, Big and Small, on Bodies, Equality, and Treatment. And you'll see how my lecture relates to this general topic. And interrupt me if I'm too fast, or if I become inaudible for whatever reason, and I'll adjust to the needs of the audience. While the entwinement of politics, and specifically human life as we know it, loosely is most broadly understood, it is safe to say at least as old as the oldest communities of Homo sapiens, real or imagined, that is, historically documented or figuratively posited. Think, for instance, of Hobbes's and Rousseau's respective states of nature. Our own modern discourse on this entwinement harks back to the ancient Greeks in particular, as the very etymology of the term politics palpably attests to. The same applies, mutatis mutandis, to our various European or Western terms come concepts of life. Leben, Leben, live, wie, vita, vida, жизнь, житие, живот, etc., which, even though some of them may not for geo- and ethno-historical reasons resemble their Greek forebears, morphologically and etymologically are still traceable to the Greek lexical conceptual brace of bios or bios and zoe, as evidenced in turn by such cross-culturally employed terms as biology and zoology. Thus, when we speak of biopolitics today, we invariably and ineluctably place ourselves in the long shadow cast by the biopolitics theorized and practiced in classical antiquity. One of the most conspicuous such practices having arguably consisted in the well-documented theorization and practice of selective infanticide and child abandonment based on eugenic criteria throughout the Greco-Roman world, whence a direct line can be drawn to our own spectrum of sanctioned eugenic practices from prenatal and genetic testing to late and partial term abortion. I only mention all of this, however, since this is neither an essay in human evolution, classical scholarship, or historical linguistics, in order to forestall potential objections to my reflections based on what might be called a philosophus eit or dicit attitude toward the two godfathers or patron saints of our symposium, Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben, whose philosophical, historical, and conceptual archaeological work on the biopolitical has certainly determined much contemporary academic thinking on the subject. What I mean is that whatever I may have to contribute to the discussion of the biopolitical today will neither necessarily be beholden to nor authoritatively guided by the parameters staked out by Foucault and Agamben, even though I shall engage them and have recourse to Foucault in particular on my own terms. Let me briefly clarify this. As I understand those parameters, they are constituted by the following core propositions, and I start with Foucault. And one of them Mark already cited, but I'll cite a different one, the earlier one. The first, from the classical age onwards, the West has witnessed a profound transformation of its mechanisms of power. One could say that the old right to make die or to let live has been replaced by the power to make live and or reject into death. So this is my own literal translation, rejeter dans la mort. That's what Foucault says in that famous definition. And the second one, for millennia, man remained what he had been for Aristotle, a living animal that was also capable of a political existence. Modern man, by contrast, is an animal in whose politics his very life as a living being is at stake. So these are two of Foucault's core propositions about biopolitics as we know them today, based on Foucault. What this means, according to Foucault, is nothing less than the eruption of life into history, as he puts it, the eruption of the phenomena specific to the life of the human species into the orders of knowledge and power. Undoubtedly, Foucault pithily surmises, for the first time in history, the biological is reflected in the political. In light of this perceived momentous transformation and the ostensible advent of the biological as such, Foucault defines biopolitics as an endeavor begun in the 18th century to rationalize the problems presented to governmental practice by the phenomena characteristic of a group of living human beings constituted as a population: health, sanitation, birth rate, longevity, race. This is his definition of biopolitics. Drawing on the work of Foucault, among others, Agamben's virtually first order of business in the construction of his own theory of biopolitics, in turn, consists in what amounts to a wholesale debunking of Foucault's entire biopolitical argument. Something that Agamben's cautious and ostensibly deferential tone should not inveigle us into overlooking or glossing over. So even though Agamben is very respectful of Foucault, what he does, in fact, means literally castrating Foucault. The Foucauldian thesis will, Agamben observes, toward the beginning of his 1995 magnum opus, Homo Sacer, and I pronounce it Sacer because that's how I studied Latin, and there are different pronunciations to this term. Sovereign power and bare life, so this is Agamben's move. The Foucauldian thesis will have to be corrected or at least completed, in the sense that what characterizes modern politics is not so much the inclusion of Zoe into the polis, which is itself absolutely ancient. This is the moment where Foucault is absolutely wrong, according to Agamben, but he doesn't say so, but effectively he does. Nor simply the fact that life as such becomes a principal object of the projections and calculations of state power. Instead, the decisive fact is that bare life, which is originally situated at the margins of the political order, gradually begins to coincide with the political realm. Several contextually relevant things happen in this signal passage. First, Agamben rejects Foucault's diagnosis of an epochal transformation of the mechanisms of power in the 18th century in conjunction with the eruption of life into history and the orders of knowledge and power. For if the latter is absolutely ancient, as Agamben notes, then so must be what Foucault calls biopolitics in its entirety, insofar as it is premised precisely on the eruption of life into politics. In other words, biopolitics, as conceived of by Foucault, has been with us all along, according to Agamben, and in no way defines the post-classical modern world. Second, Agamben anchors his rejection of Foucault's approach in the fundamental and categorical distinction between the already mentioned concepts of bios and zoe, which he adopts as the very bedrock of his own idiosyncratic biopolitical conception of the modern, as he calls it, qua gradual coincidence of the two, and Agamben implies that Foucault's epical argument concerning the eruption of life into the political refers to and aims specifically at Zoe, that is precisely the subtitular bare life, la nuda vita, as it says in Italian, of Homo sacer, natural life as such, as opposed to bios, understood as form of life or particular way of life, including political life. At which point we enter somewhat muddy waters on a number of levels. To begin with, Agamben's reading of Aristotle in particular, mediated through Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, among others, whence he most overtly derives the categorical distinction between Zoe, bare life, and bios, or form of life, is patently misleading, to say the least, as any reader of Aristotle will immediately recognize. To offer just two examples from the Nicomachean Ethics, which Agamben does not cite. These are two quotes from Aristotle now. If we declare that the function of man is a certain form of life, and the term in Greek is zoen, not bios, zoentina, and define that form of life as the exercise of the soul's faculties and activities, etc., etc. And the second quote, our definition accords with the description of the happy man as one who lives well, oi zoe in Greek, or does well, for it has virtually identified happiness with a form of good life, oi zoa, or doing well. So the emphasis is, in both instances, Zoe or its cognates are used where, according to Agamben, bios ought to be expected. So this distinction between Zoe and bios, as posited by Agamben, is simply wrong. Aristotle doesn't do this. And Agamben knows this because he's a good classicist. Thus, when Agamben claims that Aristotle would have never used the term Zoe when speaking of the various kinds of life in the polis, he would appear to be plain wrong, and plain and simple, intentionally and strategically so, we have to assume, given his erudition in matters classical and given the fact that an even cursory perusal of Aristotle's writings will yield the above data points. So literally, you just have to open the Nicomachean Ethics and you will understand that Agamben's core distinction doesn't hold up, because even for the Greeks and, go to Plato, they all use Zoe and bios interchangeably depending on the situation and the context, and not necessarily in the sense that Hannah Arendt gave these two terms on the human condition. Now, the significance of this misreading lies not in its ostensible tendentiousness per se, analyzing which shall not be my concern here, but in the fact that it cannot but entangle Agamben in self-contradiction, which in turn invalidates his critique of Foucault's biopolitical thinking. For in order to be able to correct or at least complete Foucault's transformational thesis, and to prove him wrong on the question of the inclusion of Zoe in the polis as such, according to Agamben and contra Foucault, absolutely ancient, Agamben has to go against his own claim that bios and Zoe are categorically distinct and that Aristotle would have never used the term Zoe in connection with kinds of life. That is, Agamben actually needs to acknowledge, in line with Aristotle, that bios and Zoe, while distinct in certain respects, do in fact overlap in certain others, and that consequently, Zoe will have been part and parcel of bios since antiquity. At the same time, however, in order to be able to pin Foucault's putative error on his equally putative misunderstanding of the historical significance of Zoe within the polis in particular, Agamben ostensibly needs to presuppose a categorical or essential distinction between Zoe and bios, positing, in the face of incontrovertible textual historical evidence to the contrary and flatly contradicting himself, that in the classical world, natural life, that is Zoe, is excluded from the polis. But does Foucault in fact mean specifically Zoe, as presumably strictly opposed to bios, in conceiving of biopolitics as governmental practice, targeting its population's health and longevity, among other aspects, in the first place? Would it even make sense to strictly separate Zoe from Bios in the human realm? For already Aristotle pointed out, in the context of his multiple discussions of the four causes, a man takes exercise for the sake of his health because he thinks it good for his health. And it is good fundamentally because good health is an inexorable part of a particular form of life, namely the good life, qua both bios and zoe, according to Aristotle. It seems to me then that Foucault's notion of biopolitics, which is certainly also concerned with the biological, anatomical, etc., is equally as concerned with what Agamben reductively conceives of as bios. After all, the health and well-being of an entire population, an entire polis, in and of itself implies bios, not to mention the fact that we would be hard-pressed to come up with even a single instance of presumably bare human zoe that could or would have transpired not as an organic part of some sort of human bios. In other words, to live, broadly understood, always already implies living a certain kind of life. These preliminary remarks shall be sufficient by way of a rough outline of the conceptual matrix underlying our current discussion of the biopolitical, and more importantly by way of documenting that Foucault's biopolitical endeavor has in no way been invalidated by Agamben, whose own theory of sovereign power and bare life it inevitably continues structurally to underlie. Neither endeavor, however, ought to be taken at face value given the conceptual historical problems outlined above. What seems to be at stake here then, one way or another, and above all, in my view, is the question of how the singular life relates to the particular life it is distinct from and to the universal life of the group it is part of, be it in terms of an alleged comprehensive gradual coincidence of life and polis, as Agamben has it, or in terms of the perceived ability of the powers that be to make, live, and reject into death, as per Foucault. It is the latter in particular that I wish to begin from. So, this is the original statement. On pourrait dire qu'au vieux droit de faire mourir ou de laisser vivre, c'est substituer un pouvoir de faire vivre ou de rejeter dans la mort. This is the original statement of Foucault's, where making live and letting die turns into rejecting into death, etc. I quote the original here solely in order to demonstrate that the English translation faithfully replicates the pivotal figure making Foucault's pithy dictum. The question of whose historical truth value I do not address as such. And by the way, the chiastic imbalance introduced by the phrase rejeter dans la mort, instead of the expected laisser mourir, to me implies a kind of cavalier of offhanded, almost random and occasional discarding of certain lives in contrast to the deliberate and willful and intentional faire mourir, which would be expected, right? I mean, he uses reject into death as opposed to let die. But still there's a mirror image, there's a figure of speech that is engaged here. Now, suffice it to note that the dictum's major transformational premise can and has been contested by at least one authoritative reader, to wit, Agamben. And incidentally, one does indeed wonder how Foucault's entire biopolitical framework might have to be rewritten in view of a statement such as, the era of the great depredations of famine and plague was over before the French Revolution. That's verbatim Foucault. Which subtends and informs Foucault's transformational thesis, and which has conclusively been historically disproved by the current pandemic. So, would Foucault still write the same words today, after the French Revolution, where the era obviously has not ended, the era he's talking about? Besides, it is worth keeping in mind that Foucault's entire archaeology of knowledge, of which his biopolitical theory is a part, may apply within limits having to do with demography, class, socioeconomics, etc., to cultural political contexts such as modern England and France, while being utterly misplaced with regard to, say, the Soviet Union under Stalin in particular, or the United States, pre-Civil War to be sure, but also for much of its subsequent history, where slaves and many of the descendants have certainly not benefited from the putative make-live phenomenon. Not to mention contemporary political systems that are not primarily concerned with making live in the first place. Which is why, to me, the abiding force of Foucault's dictum lies a fortiori in its make-up as a figure of thought, characterized by a chiasmic transposition, make, die, and let live, being replaced by make, live, and reject into death, whose very tropicality functions as a conceptual, interpretive handle malleably deployable in any number of contexts, such as the United States today, which will be the main focus for the remainder of this talk. So, what interests me is really the figure of thought underlying Foucault's entire proposition, and not its historical veracity, correctness, etc. More specifically, it seems to me that Foucault's handle allows us metaphorically to frame and thus creatively to make sense of our own contemporary moment, which may or may not, in turn, help us adumbrate the limits of Foucault's biopolitical thought. A similar metaphoricity, or rather metonymicity, by the way, marks Agamben's stipulation of the extermination camp as the biopolitical paradigm, or nomos, of the modern Turku. I mean, again, it's a metaphor, if anything, and nothing historically true or veridical about it per se. Applying Foucault's handle to the contemporary US, then, one could say that what we have been witnessing since the inception of Black Lives Matter in 2013, and emphatically since the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with Black Lives Matter and the pushback it has received from large swaths of the powers that be, is the concomitant rather than successive, as Foucault has it, unfolding of the right to make die or to let live vis-a-vis some, and the power to make live or reject into death vis-a-vis others in a most blatant and palpable fashion. So both happen simultaneously as opposed to successively. Whereby the chiastic make live and reject into death, cum make die and let live figure gets metonymically, metaphorically focalized in the most basic activity of human life, namely breathing. Granted as it is by governmental practice to some who are made to breathe, while being forcibly withheld from others who are made to suffocate. From the vantage point of today's USA in particular, breathing can be said to have assumed the position of a kind of biopolitical paradigm or nomos, previously held, according to Agamben, by the camp. Analogously, Auschwitz, the emblematic or symbolic camp par excellence, can be said topically to have been replaced by the figure of George Floyd, in whom the intersection and concatenation of a certain kind of governmental practice with the workings of COVID-19 have assumed the tragically metonymic, emblematic, or symbolic contours of someone who died of lack of oxygen during the COVID-19 pandemic, like millions of others across the globe, albeit not due to illness like the latter, but rather due to a governmental practice that affects, mutatis mutandis, a sizable number of the US population, and that should, according to Foucault's interpretation of history, be above all concerned with making live rather than rejecting into death, a practice that predominantly targets African Americans and that manifests itself in lethal ways not necessarily restricted to asphyxiation, which can be said to be but its most agonizing face, epitomized precisely by George Floyd. That the camp also employed the governmental practice of death by asphyxiation, moreover, points up a haunting historical continuity and gives pause as far as the arguable force of Agamben's arguments in turn may be concerned. Signally, governmental practice, presumably indeed concerned with a just application of triage amid the pandemic, has equally affected Black and brown people in the US in a disproportionately negative way. Who gets to breathe and how, and who gets to suffocate and how, has emerged as the key biopolitical question of our time. A question that concerns, to quote Foucault, health and longevity, and above all, race, among the population that has recently been taken up most forcefully and poignantly by Ta-Nehisi Coates, among others, who has made it the question of his life. Quote, how one should live within a black body in a society whose governmental practice would appear not to be primarily concerned with making black bodies breathe, least of all ostensibly with making it easier for us to breathe. To also quote the concluding lines of a small Needful fact, Ross Gay's elegy for Eric Garner. And there it is. And Eric Garner was obviously preceded George Floyd in being the face of brutality and asphyxiation. So that was Ross Gay's tribute. Coates's and Gay's interventions in the biopolitical through the prism of the contemporary African-American experience in the United States emphatically underscore that bare life is but a fiction at best and cannot be conceived of other than as always already transpiring as a form of life. An entwinement saliently expressed in Coates's emphasis on how one should live, and in Gay's subtle distinction between breathing as such and a certain kind of easier breathing, which is precisely what is centrally at stake for both above and beyond one's putatively bare physiology. And let me reiterate one more time that we're dealing in the figurative here. Metaphorical, metonymical, symbolic, and emblematic, in the sense that any and all speculations, theoretical, metonymical, theoretical, fictional, poetic, as here undertaken and attested to, ought perforce, as Arendt put it, not to presume, as a matter of course, to be able to offer concrete solutions or answers in matters of practical politics. Which doesn't mean, of course, as James Finlayson points out, that those who theorize, fictionalize, or poeticize cannot lobby for practical change like anyone else. It only means that they do so not as experts, but as individual citizens. So, whatever we have to say, the humility that theorizing is one thing, and even though it's practical and political as such, there is still a step to be taken to really translate it into real-life politics. It is to two such individual citizens that I now turn on the final leg of my speculative journey, both of whom have more or less concomitantly responded to the globally headline-making killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota on May 25, 2020. An event that for many epitomized the hard truth that while all members of the population are presumably equal, some are more equal than others, to quote George Orwell. And that the governmental practice of making live did and does not seem to apply to people like Floyd. The putative transformation in the mechanisms of power we have arguably witnessed since the classical age notwithstanding. Terence Hayes' gripping elegy for George Floyd, which is this one. So, the mouse does or does not work, but, oh, there it is, but somehow I can't scroll. Help, please. Thank you so much, appreciate it. Just for everyone to see the entire poem. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And how do I do it next time? Because I think we'll need another.
Just scroll like this.
Okay, great. Wonderful, thank you. Terence Hayes' gripping elegy for George Floyd, a poetic exercise in biopolitical denunciation published on June 22nd, 2020 in The New Yorker, that I cannot go into all of the details of here, concludes with the verse, "Amid till the end of time," which emblematically fuses a line from Prince's 1987 song, Adore, with the name and historical figure of Emmett Till, notoriously lynched at the age of 14 in 1955 in Mississippi, to project a bleak future in which the black body will be made to die till the end of time. As in Gay's elegy for Eric Garner, who died as a result of an illegal chokehold applied by a police officer, the eponymous protagonist of Hay's elegy is George Floyd, who was made metaphorically to inhale dirt and consequently asphyxiate, ironically, underneath the ring of fire of the officer's intimated Apple Watch, which fire ring is correlated with physical fitness and strength rather than its opposite, as fatally experienced by Floyd. What Hayes stages in his canon or round-like poem that weaves together multiple overlapping voices and citations is fundamentally biopolitics in painfully witnessed action. Unlike Foucault's transformation of the mechanisms of power, the transformation depicted by Hayes does not simply reject into death while being concerned with making live overall, but brings about active killing. The bullet point of transformation both kills and fires the life of the party. That's 2 verses from this poem. Making some die and perversely contributing to the heightened vivaciousness that is the very joy of living on the part of others. Like the man kneeling in blue, that notorious representative of government practice par excellence. Floyd's treatment at the hands of the man kneeling in blue, emphatically as portrayed by Hayes, starkly epitomizes a mechanism of power that, Hayes poetically adumbrates, has not been and will, till the end of time, not be concerned with making black lives live and breathe, nor even with occasionally, as it were, rejecting them into death, but with willfully and intentionally making them die, pure and simple. So a complete debunking of Foucault's thesis in actu, if you will, applied to the situation of George Floyd. What is but alluded to, intimated and poetically scrambled, as it were, in Hayes's text, gets articulated full blast and propaganda style in Claudia Rankine's Weather, a poetic call to arms written immediately following the killing of George Floyd and published within a day of Hayes's poem on June 21st, 2020, on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and explicitly looking out to the November election later that year. So let me... I got it. There it is. Unlike Hayes, Rankine links the asphyxiation of George Floyd to the current pandemic and denounces the biopolitical inequalities it has thrown into particularly stark relief hands-on. I mean a form of governing that deals out death and names it living, whereby the governmental practice here referred to concerns both the inequitable allocation and distribution of medical treatments in view of COVID-19 at the state and federal levels, as well as the inequitable meting out of justice on the part of state, federal, and local organs of governance, such as the police. 6 feet under for underlying conditions, black, just as the blues kneeling on a neck with the full weight of a man in blue. The underlying conditions being, of course, both the intimated general state of health of black and brown people in the US, who are, for a number of historical and socioeconomic reasons, disproportionately affected by obesity, heart disease, diabetes, asthma, etc., at least in certain parts of the country, and the socio-political conditions under which being a person of color is ostensibly in and of itself a lethal hazard, as most memorably captured in the ubiquitous quip, "driving while black." Now, the question whether Hayes's and Rankine's poetic assessments are historically valid or correct seems less important in the present context than the very fact that their interventions explicitly belie the notion of an epochal transformation of the mechanisms of power as stipulated by Foucault. Rankine's A Form of Governing That Deals Out Death and Names It Living, in particular, gives the screw of the Foucauldian figure yet another turn, ironically, squarely against itself. Nothing has changed about the primal power to make die or let live, which has remained precisely that, insofar as any putative emphasis on making live is, in fact, its very opposite, for more than some. Interestingly, it almost seems as though Rankine, who would appear to be well versed in French postmodern theory, as evidenced by the reference to Nietzsche's famously forgotten umbrella, which Jacques Derrida has made hay of in his 1978 book Éperon, Le Style de Nietzsche, it almost seems then as though Rankine were replying specifically to Foucault by denouncing a form of governing that deals out death and names it living. Thank you. Do we do questions now? Or?
Yes, we do questions now. So use your opportunity to ask questions. I can run around with a microphone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. That was wonderful as a first paper as well, particularly because you really went into the details of this distinction and of the definition between Foucault and Agamben, and I found that very interesting. I wasn't aware of this, use of Agamben. It was always counterintuitive to me, because I would have always thought, well, it makes more sense to have Bios and Zoe vice versa, just by the fact that Zoe would be also a first name for a woman and so on. So I was always wondering about this definition that Agamben gave. So I just wanted to check and get some precision on that. So you are saying that actually in antiquity in Greece, they made not really a difference between the two terms, or was it rather really the inverse of how Agamben defines it? Or you said depending on the situation. I would like to get a bit more the idea about how it was really used at the time. Yeah,
so,
the two terms.
Sure. We simply have to, well, first of all, the Greeks did have two terms, and everyone knows that. But the two terms are not as clearly defined in terms of what Agamben calls bare life, as opposed to forms of life. And, you know, these two quotes that he doesn't quote from Aristotle, he quotes other passages from the Politics and from the Ethics. But these two quotes that I provided simply, you know, to put it simply, prove, if you just need one instance, that whenever Aristotle talks about forms of life or kinds of life, he may use at times the word bios, and at times he may use the word zoe, or zoa, or zoen, to live well. So whatever the valences of these two terms may have been, they are not what Agamben makes them out to be. And it is only important in the, you know, Agambian context, if you will, because the distinction is the ultimate bedrock of his entire argument. To the extent that, you know, to the extent that bare life as a concept is derived from this putative notion of Zoe, it's plain wrong. It's simply wrong. And so it is possible that very famous philosophers publish many, many books and are just plain wrong because the editors didn't know better. And someone should have pointed it out, and people have. He just doesn't care. But I think he knows that he's wrong. It's a strategic argumentative determination that he has made. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, I mean, he's become really big through the detour of the United States, and then just like Derrida was re-imported into Europe. And, you know, many of my colleagues probably don't know classical languages. I don't know. They just take it on faith that Agamben must be right. And if you look at the, you know, backsplash of the Stanford editions of his works, it's always emphasized what a great classicist he is. So he must be right. Now, I'm not a classicist, and even I know that he's wrong. If I were a classicist, I could have given you many more instances. But so, yes, Zoe and Bios are not completely distinct. They are distinct. But Zoe is as much, you know, a form of life as it is not. But the one thing I think that Aristotle, for one, and certainly Plato, the two guarantors of truth for Agamben, understood from the very beginning is that there is no zoe that is not always already political, as Aristotle puts it. I mean, and he applies the term politics, and this is where Foucault is wrong as well. And again, people know it. It's not like I'm divulging a truth that was secret. When Aristotle defines politics, he also uses bees as an example. The bees are also political beings. They are zoe, zoon politikon applies also not only to anthropos, but also to the bee. So there are many, ants and bees are also political beings. Now, so the very notion of bare life, which to me this is the real problem. And only based on this notion was he able, Agamben that is, to establish this edifice, owing to which he could then make the claim that the camp has become the emblematic kind of locus of contemporary society, with Guantanamo being the present day kind of avatar of Auschwitz as the Uber camp of all camps, is simply theoretically, it may or may not be politically valid and important to make this claim. For polemical purposes, this is not something I adjudicate on, but it's theoretically speaking, conceptually, insofar as it is derived from a linguistic distinction, it simply doesn't hold up. I mean, just...
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed particularly the combination of theory and poetry. It's really great. I want to ask about, I think it was very convincing, this critique of the Zohar, some philological, some reconstruction by Agamben. But I think that bare life is actually not Zohar. It is this point of indistinction between the biological and the political, the point where biological life is actually captured by the political one, and subjected to this unconditional power. So that, it is true that probably Aristotle didn't think we saw what Agamben put into his mouth, so to say. But yes, I think that actually the important concept in Agamben is bare life, and it's not quite the same as Zoe. As I thought, when you read Agamben, sometimes you get exactly these impressions, but I didn't want actually to go into this. But it seems to me that actually when you analyze the poems and the facts, and you said that biopolitical situation shows that actually it's not an issue of making live, but of making die. Then I think that in this sense, this is a very Agambenian way of understanding biopolitics. I think what Marcos was saying, biopolitics in our times is undistinguishable from thanatopolitics. So that I think that this argument that I thought was also very convincing about the George Floyd's case, but actually goes quite a lot in an Agambenian direction. What do you think? And you were also actually criticizing Foucault in a way.
Just lest I be misunderstood, I respect both deeply and profoundly. So polemicizing against Foucault and Agamben, who am I to do this, right? But it's to me, it's always interesting to kind of dig into those interstitial spaces where great minds purposefully, I would imagine, because I have to assume that both Agamben and Foucault know exactly what they're doing. They're too intelligent, knowledgeable. I just give them the benefit of the doubt. So it's a strategic decision to misread historical textual evidence for their own purposes. And, for all we know, Foucault may actually have believed that the period, the age of pandemics, is over. He may have thought that in 1976, 7, and 8, when he wrote the first volume of The History of Sexuality, where he first defines biopolitics big time, and then in a lectures at the Collège de France, roughly at the same time and a little later. So there's profound respect, just as a kind of framework. Very briefly to the notion of bare life. Now that notion in Agamben, as far as I know, and I may be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. This is a direct transposition from a term used by Benjamin, bloßes Leben. And the German notion of bloßes Leben has nothing to do, it can be naked life in the sense of the Musulman, as it then becomes emblematic in Agamben. And that's a problematic statement to begin with, because some of the Musulmaner, as we know, did come back. And they had the will to live, even though they seemed to him as if they didn't. And because Levi describes them as such as well. But what do we know externally, right? I mean, all of these projections, Kant would call it a subreption. It's pathetic fallacy, because Levi thought that they don't have any will to live anymore. Doesn't mean that he knew what was happening inside those people. So, bloßes Leben in Benjamin is not necessarily a biological concept. He was referring to the working class and many, many other things that were, inherently forms of life. So let's put it this way. If Agamben's were a dissertation, I'm sure that his advisory committee would have flagged all of this. Because it's flaggable. So I have nothing more, it's published, it's part of the canon now, and we have to deal with it, but it doesn't make it any more true or valid. So his notion of naked life is a problem to begin with. Because even Benjamin did not conceive of it the way then Agamben makes it out to be. And then when Hannah Arendt improved on the concept in her own terms, and these are the three, Foucault, Hannah Arendt, and Benjamin, basically the godfathers, they all mean different things, using this term. In terms of the question, is it an Agambenian, if you will, approach? At some point, the question, I think, presents itself. Well, let me put it this way, and this is very personal. To me, for instance, Foucault has really helped me understand what it means to be human. So reading Foucault really helped me understand my own society, my own historical moment, my emplacement, how politics works. Reading Agamben, on the other hand, has not, to me, because it was always too outré, too polemical, and too historically wrong, as far as I'm concerned. And not only philologically. And in that sense, whatever resemblance my own reading may have had with Agamben, let's put it this way, like the typical Hollywood proviso, purely coincidental in the sense that this is my tribute to the, basically patron saints of the conference, but I think we can do all of this. Foucault would still remain very helpful because I think he's the much more diligent and the much more responsible historical reader and thinker than Agamben. We don't need Agamben to understand this, while Foucault might actually help us deal with what's happening today. That's my personal view, and I don't want to diminish his achievement at all. It's just that in my own work, I've never needed Agamben to buttress or shore up my own arguments, whereas I've often referred to Foucault because he's really, in a way, more contextual and historically more profitable.
We'll do a final round of applause for Michael.
Thank you.